I'm going to introduce Rabbi Tureff on behalf of Adult Education in Mishkan Tefillah, and I do hope more people come in. We had a nice announcement in Shul yesterday, and we've had wonderful announcements in our Mishkan Messenger. So hopefully other people will be coming in. If not, we will enjoy it. Who is ever here will benefit from the blessing of having Rabbi Chaim Tureff here with us today. Rabbi Tureff recently wrote a book called Recovery in Torah, Models of Spirituality and Healing, which deals with the intersection of Torah and addiction recovery. He is the founder of STARS, STARS, all capitalized, which guide people struggling with addiction by focusing on the spiritual component through seminars, groups, and one-on-one coaching. He is the Rav Beit Sefer at Pressman Academy, in Los Angeles, a spiritual advisor at the Soberman's estate in Arizona, and a member of the Teachers on Fire Kollel. He is producer of a documentary called The Civil Rights Trip, Shared Fellowship, Reinventing a New Tomorrow, which is about African Americans and Jewish Americans. So without further ado, Rabbi Chaim Tureff.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. That was a lot of enthusiasm. I appreciate that. As I mentioned to Phil earlier, everything is, even though what I'm going to say, I argue with sometimes personally, everything is hashkata pratit, which means it comes from God. So when Phil and I spoke, I don't know, in September maybe it was, I'm not quite sure. And he's like, oh, we do this on Zoom. And I was like, I can come in. It's great. He's like, no, we do Zoom. And I'm like, okay. So I got COVID this week. And so it worked out perfectly because Zoom is perfect for this. Tomorrow, God willing, will be day 10, which means that I will not be able to give anybody COVID, according to the doctors. I spoke to them this morning. But the point being is that you can hear me clearly. I'm not masked up, which if I were in person with you guys, either I would have given you the option of not coming in if you didn't want me to, or masked up. So it worked out really perfectly. So everything kind of works out.
Well, it's good you're feeling better and that you're almost at the end of the situation.
Yeah, no, it was last Shabbat, I was starting to feel pretty weak. And I just thought, well, it's Shabbat. I'm tired. I had a very busy week. I had that thing that's going around LA, that walking pneumonia during Sukkot. So I was like, I'm just tired. But that's not what it was. I wasn't just tired. I mean, I was, but there was a reason. So thank you. Thank you for the well wishes. And yes, God willing, or refuah shlema. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to share from one of the parshiot, actually, from the book, kind of frame it, and then from there the slideshow that I made kind of centered around this idea of stigma within the Jewish community when it comes to people that are struggling with addiction. The truth is, in the Jewish community, there's a lot of stigma about pretty much everything that is not within the normative, whatever normative is, right? So you could pick probably 50 different things, and within our community, I know myself, my life, I've heard, well, that's not a Jewish thing, right? I've heard, oh, that's in the non-Jewish community, or that's within the Jewish community that's this or that, but it's not within our community. And the truth is, as with every community, we have addiction, we have adultery, we have abuse, we have spousal abuse, we have cheating, we have people that steal, all kinds of things, right? Just like everyone else does, we do too. And it is a Jewish thing. And the best way that it was explained to me years ago, as I got into this work, was that the Torah is a guidebook, right? And within it is all kinds of crazy stuff. We've got, I mean, last week in last week's Parsha, Vayera, right? We have Lot having sex with his daughters, right? And if we go back 2 weeks before that, according to the Gemara, Noach is raped by his son. Like, this is some serious stuff that I think everybody would agree is like, wow, these are big deal. It's not small. It's not like, oh, I took a bag of chips and I didn't pay for them, even though I should. But I mean, these are serious things. And they're all in the Torah. It's some explicitly and some less explicit. So it really is a guidebook for everything. So I'm going to I'll read from Vayera, since we just had Vayera, from Recovering the Torah, and then go into this idea of looking at stigma within the Jewish community. So I'll give a brief framing of the book. I wrote the book because I was working at a rehab center, and at the center, which is it's not Beit Tshuva, which I do some teaching at, and it's not the one that I work at currently in Phoenix, but it was another one here in Los Angeles. And they actually asked me to run a therapy group, and it was specifically for men that were struggling with addiction, and it happened to be Orthodox men. And so I ran this group, and I was trying to think, how can I get everybody to kind of, because as it is I would say within the more frum community, there's even more stigma, whether it's real or it's not, it doesn't matter, it's there. And so I started each of my therapy sessions, whether this is legal or not, talking about Torah. And I focused on whatever the Parsha was. And some of the people in the group these are people that, many of them, I would say, are much more knowledgeable than myself, and some of which I knew within the community. And I was like, wow. And they were like, this is good. Thank you for sharing this, after a number of weeks. And so my wife said, write it down. So hence I wrote it down and put it in a book. That's just kind of where it came from. So this is from Vayera. I remember when I was young and I thought that I could do something. Everyone else around me did not believe that I could. All my friends doubted me, and I may have even questioned my own ability to succeed at the task. Eventually, I gave up because I did not see success as a possibility. In Parshat Vayera, Abraham and Sarah are visited by angels who come to tell them at 190 years old, respectively, that they were about to have a child. Abraham laughed with joy, while Sarah also laughed with disbelief. After I am withered, will I have smooth skin? And my husband is old. According to Rashi, Sarah did not believe that she could physically have a child, having seen how her body had changed and aged. So she was dismissive of the news. She had also endured years of barrenness, during which her maidservant Hagar had a child from Abraham. So it made sense that Sarah had given up hope and did not believe the news. This is similar to someone in recovery from addiction. Many times, all the signs that the person has seen and experienced in their life lead them to feel hopeless. They feel like they've gone down another dead-end road with nowhere to turn. The person does not feel that there's any way they can find sobriety. Every avenue seems closed, and every time they try to get sober, they experience failure. Just as Sarah no longer had physical signs that would make it possible for her to have a child, the addict too sees physical signs in their life that convince them that they're beyond help. Things such as loss of relationships, a job, a house, money, or health. Many times when an addict finally meets someone who is in recovery, they listen with a sense of loss and impossibility at the notion of becoming sober. But as step 2 of Alcoholics Anonymous notes, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. That's right, something greater than ourselves is able to perform open miracles and lead us on a path of sobriety. if the person would trust that Hashem is there for them and believe that sobriety is a possibility, open miracles would occur. Just as Sarah was able to have a child when she was old after years of barrenness, so too Hashem gives those struggling with addiction the opportunity to find a new life and new hope as they walk the path of recovery. So any thoughts or comments before I jump into kind of tying in this notion of stigma within the Jewish community?
I have to mention that there are people who will say the 12-step thing isn't very Jewish, and I think you're changing that. So I think that's a positive development. I have certainly known some people in trouble. I'll tell you, my brother was in a problem with substance abuse, not recently, fortunately. And it was interesting that the place that helped him were the Chabadniks, because they convinced him that there was a power beyond just him. And that at the time that was actually quite a blessing and quite a difference. And I agree with you. We do have to fight this other idea of too many stigmas, that be a little more relaxed about things and not always so uptight, or also in denial is maybe more the thing. There's a mythology, Jews aren't alcoholics. The Jews don't get shikker, and that's a lie.
Yeah.
Right. There's a Yiddish saying that's it's like a goy is a shikker, and there's a story about that. And besides it being tone deaf on many levels, it's also not true. Are there non-Jews that are alcoholics? Of course. Are there Jews that are alcoholics? Of course. They're not mutually exclusive, that's for sure.
I also really liked how you turned the story of Sarah into a message of hope for people struggling with addiction. Having had a good friend who struggled with alcoholism, and she had various self-help books and stuff, but she never did the 12 steps because she struggled with the idea of giving up, to surrendering to a higher power. But anyway, I really like how you turned the story of Sarah into a story of hope for alcoholics. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just like Sarah, an addict might laugh and say, no, it can't happen with me. I cannot I'm unrecoverable. And yet, if you have this courage, but getting to that point of having the courage and faith is connecting the dots. I'm very curious how you connect those dots particularly.
Well, I'll say what you said when somebody mentions, like, I can't do this, right? So there's a spiritual principle in Judaism, right? And also, so I'm a martial artist. I moved to LA. I was a martial arts instructor. So I also like Bruce Lee. So Bruce Lee said something, maybe he got it from Judaism, maybe he didn't, where he's like, you're never allowed to say something negative about yourself, right? And in Judaism, there's a notion when it comes to Lashon Hara, right, which is gossip, you're not allowed to speak Lashon Hara about yourself. Also, like, you're actually not. And you're not supposed to put it, it's called an Ayin Hara, which means like the evil eye or something, right? We're not supposed to actually say bad things about ourselves. And one of the cycles that people get into, unfortunately, is this notion of saying negative things and giving up hope, right? And not believing that there's any opportunity. And sometimes the first time that anybody even has this opportunity, which is what I wrote down, is when they meet somebody and they see that that they have gone through whatever they've gone through, and they're still alive, they're still standing. And unfortunately, part of it is this, which is why I bring up the idea of stigma within our community. It's that everybody within our community is a certain way, right? So this is not a Jewish person that I'm going to bring up, but it's probably a story that most of you, if not all of you, have heard. I think it was it was definitely before COVID. There was a family in Colorado. They were known as like the Facebook family. I don't remember the guy's name. You could Google it. When we're done, you could look him up. It's all over. It was all over the news. So he was married with 2 children, beautiful family, beautiful wife, beautiful children. He's really good looking. They have a beautiful house in Colorado, like outside of Denver. And their pictures, they are called the Facebook family because everything, like all their pictures that they put were amazing. He ended up killing his wife and 2 kids because he was cheating on his wife. And it was all over the news, right? And it ends up that all those pictures were exactly that, right? They're not real. It was fake, right? He was a terrible human, unfortunately. But people see that. And I'm saying people from the outside see that and they look and they say, look, I'm not married, or I'm not good looking, or I don't have a big house, or I don't have children, whatever it is that they're struggling with, because we all struggle with, you don't have to be in, this was the founder of Beit Sefer said this, Harriet. She said, everybody's in recovery from something, right? We are all struggling in this world from certain things, whether it's substance or not. We all have things, God places, we all have challenges uniquely to us. And that's a beautiful thing. But when we're judging, there's a saying in program, can't judge my insides by somebody else's outsides, right? And so this idea of looking at this family and really beating yourself up, and I would say within our community, we do that because we are, I don't want to sound anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, but we are pretty judgmental as a people. I think that we are, quite frankly. As somebody who works within different denominations, I have, as I told Phil, I studied at Chabad Yeshiva. I really navigate within all different denominations. Unfortunately, I sometimes hear the stuff from all different denominations about different kinds of Jews, right? And it can get icky. It can get icky, unfortunately, and we do it to each other. And so people feel like, well, if my child didn't go to, though this has obviously changed since October 7th, what I'm about to say, possibly, but if my child didn't go to an Ivy League school, they're not this, or if my child isn't a doctor, or if my child's not married to in a heteronormative relationship, they're not this, or if they, whatever it is, there's something wrong with me or my family. I did a bad job as a parent, or I'm a bad human, all these things. And the truth is, anybody in any relationship knows relationships are hard. They're complicated. Families are hard. They're complicated. And that's okay. And if we can all accept that and start at that baseline that we're all human, then we can kind of be able to go from there. But unfortunately, within our community, there's nobody that abuses their spouse. That doesn't happen. That's other people. Well, as somebody who experienced that as a child, I can tell you that's not true, right? And my parents were Jewish. That's not true. That doesn't, right? And whatever those ands are. So when we go from that baseline, as opposed to we're all created from God, which means that we all have beautiful things within us, and then we all have things that we have to work on, and that we all have challenges. Starting at that baseline, then we can see the other with less judgment. So I will pull this up. And so I stigma in the Jewish community. So I started with the definition of stigma, right? A set of negative and often unfair beliefs that a society or a group of people have about something. And so, again, I was coming at this from addiction, but really within our community, it could be so many other things, quite frankly, this idea of a stigma. But I can tell you, as somebody who has spoken at a number of synagogues in LA, in Alabama, in New York, in Florida, in Illinois, in North Carolina, in Tennessee, in different places. Every single time I talk about this, people will come up to me after and say, I'm struggling with something, or my wife, or my husband, or my son, or my grandchild, or my. And invariably, many times when I go to speak at a place, the rabbi or whomever I speak to beforehand is like, I had a community. Actually, it was very interesting. I spoke at this summer in North Carolina, and the rabbi, great guy, brought me out there. Obviously, believes in like helping people, but said, "This isn't that community. I just want you to know that this isn't that community. We have an older community. It was more of a retirement community." And he's like, "That's not our issue here. We have other things, but this is not it." I kid you not, half the people came up to me afterwards and said, "Have you ever met an 82-year-old heroin addict?" And it was hilarious. And I was like, "Actually, I haven't." And, or have you ever met, "I've been sober for 32 years, or my daughter is this." At least half the community. And it wasn't it wasn't hundreds of people, but there were about 75 people there at the, Friday night. I spoke on a Friday night. And it's invariable that this is something that pervades all communities. So these are just some facts about addiction. Basically, I won't read it all, but basically, we estimate that 1 in 5 people struggle from some form of addiction. And the lower estimates are at about 10%, of people, which would mean, excuse me, close to 750,000 Jews struggle with addiction at the very least. And that's at a small estimate. That's quite a few. So at any shul, whether, if you've got 200 people at a synagogue, you've got at least 20 people, and more than likely 30 or 40 that have something that they're struggling with. Probably somebody that you sit next to on Shabbos has something that they're struggling with. You might know about it, you might not know about it, right? But part of breaking the stigma is being able to have it out there so that people don't have to hide, right? There's a book in the recovery world called Out of the Shadows. It specifically is talking about sex addiction, but the title to me is what's profound, Out of the Shadows, right? That somebody doesn't need to be in the shadows when they're struggling with something. So this pasuk I brought, right? This is from Bereshit, right? Which is this B'Tselem Elokim, right? And God created humankind in divine image, creating in the image of God. Meaning even the heroin addict is created in God's image, right? Even. And I say that, obviously, I don't mean it that way, but many times we see it as, oh, this is somebody else. This does not impact us. This is them, whoever the them is, but it's not me. It's not us. And the truth is that every single person, even people we don't like, right, is created in God's image. Everybody is created in God's image, right? And the Torah clearly states that. And so if we can come from that idea, right, then it's easier to help those that need the help. And then from Vayikra, right? This is from Parshat Kedoshim, right? We don't take vengeance, we don't bear a grudge. And then V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, ani Hashem, right? To love your neighbor as yourself, right? And this is, I'm not the first one. The very first Jew to really try to integrate Torah and recovery was Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky. So if you've heard of him, he's the one that actually got it, I would say, within the Jewish community, that it's okay to go to 12 steps, because the 12 steps, I think Jeff mentioned this earlier, it's definitely seen as a Christian thing. And there's a reason why it's seen as a Christian thing. One, the founders were devoutly Christian, so that would make sense. Two, most meetings, not all meetings, but most meetings occur in a church, right? And so these, and three, sometimes at the end of meetings, they'll say the Lord's Prayer or the prayer of St. Francis or some other, I would say, Christian tinged or outwardly Christian, not tinged at all, prayer. And so that can be uncomfortable as a Jew, right? You're sitting in a meeting and right, and you've got right above you the cross and Jesus on the cross. That can be uncomfortable. For some people, that can be against the way that they follow the Torah, meaning, understandably, some people are uncomfortable, right? And so Dr. Twersky said, wait a minute, these are spiritual in nature. These men that, because they were men, the men that came up with the 12 steps, yes, they're devout Christians, but they're on to something, right? And the part that Rabbi Twersky really focused on is the V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, that component. He mentioned a story once where he was meeting with a client, and she was talking about what was going on and how her friends had been there for her, people in a 12-step meeting. And he said, I can't imagine in any synagogue in general, being able to call somebody at 2 a.m. and not only do they answer the phone, but they'll be there for you. He goes, and yet within these 12-step groups, that's exactly what happens. You could walk into a meeting, you don't know a soul in that room, you can share some pretty heinous stuff that you're going through. And more than likely, there will be somebody, if not many somebodies, who's there willing to give you their number, take your number, and say, like, what can I do for you? And he said, I don't always see that in the synagogue realm. Now, it doesn't mean, it's not an indictment on synagogue life, but it is saying this idea of v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. What does that mean? And right, do I only invite people over for Shabbat dinner or lunch who are my friends? Or do I invite people over who I don't necessarily know at my shul or who are disconnected? It's easy to invite, friends over. Is that really like what Abraham and Sarah were doing in last week's Parsha, right? When they invited the angels and they made food and they did all of that. Is that really what that is? Or is it when I invite somebody I don't connect with or who I don't know or who needs something, right? And that's the Ahavta l'recha kamocha. Then this next one, right? So this is from Mishlei, that's Shlomo HaMelech wrote this, right? And to me, it makes me think of an addict very much so. Again, in Judaism, I would say the way that it's practiced, not the way that it is. We think of perfection, and we're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. If we study the Torah, even our imahot and avot are not perfect, right? Even if when we look at them that way, they made mistakes, and I think that that's a beautiful thing. It's not a criticism, right? So 7 times the righteous person falls and gets up, while the wicked are tripped by one misfortune. So sometimes people don't want to help somebody because they're like, well, again, they're struggling, I'll say, with alcohol. I tried to help them, and then they went back and they started drinking again. Okay. I don't know about you, but some of my character defects, it's taken years to work on. Nothing happens overnight. It really doesn't. We didn't get to the place, right? Somebody didn't get to the place of being an alcoholic overnight, more than likely. And so they're not going to necessarily stop drinking overnight, right? And so, again, those of us that, if you're in a relationship with somebody, right? If you have a partner, if you're married, you probably screw up all the time, and right, and you're not necessarily thrown out immediately, right? And so, having that acceptance and realizing that we make a mistake. You know, that's that famous saying, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And sometimes it's 2 steps forwards and 3 steps back, but you're still trying. That's the thing. That's the spiritual principle, is that we never give up, and that we constantly are making an effort, right, and trying to improve every single day. And so if we can look at it from that lens, it takes away some of the judgment. And then this is from Pirkei Avot, which quotes then the first quote, right, from Parshat Bereshit, right, which is B'Tselem Elokim, right, right, where it's beloved is each person, for they were created in the image, right, and that's a beautiful thing. If we're able, and I would say in our world right now, it's a very difficult thing for everybody. It's something that I would say is a test of mankind, is seeing somebody who is either doing something that I am diametrically opposed to, or doing something that I know that is not good for them, and how can I help them? Or even somebody who does not agree with me, whether it's spiritually, politically, whatever it is, still seeing them as B'Tselem Elokim, right? And that's difficult, and I would say that's definitely a test for our generation, certainly right now. So part of stigma, right? Part of stigma is leaving the person alone. Part of getting sober, and I would say part of anything in life that any of us struggles with, whether it's, God forbid, an illness, whether it's character defects, whether it's addiction, whether it's all the above, none of the above, something else, is connection, connection, connection. Everybody needs connection. I.e., we need a spiritual connection, but we also need a connection with other people, which, by the way, is very spiritual, right? So that's mentorship. So I brought this one from Pirkei Avot, right, where Yoshua ben Parachia, right, he said, right, find yourself a teacher, right, acquire yourself a companion, right, and then judge, right, Dan et kol ha'adam l'chaf zchut, right? Judge everybody favorably. So 2 parts there. 1, looking favorably at people, giving them some sort of empathy, compassion, where they're coming from, and also realizing that everybody needs support. Nobody can do anything alone. We saw during COVID specifically that addiction blew up even more, if that's even possible. As it is, it's an epidemic, but it blew up even more. And one of the reasons, which again, for anybody that's experienced addiction, works with addiction, has family in addiction, knows why. Because isolation, right? Isolation. We need each other. People need each other. It's how God created us. We need other people. We need those connections. We need the warmth. We need the touch. We need the smell, the feel, whatever it might be. We need that right. There's an energy, right? You've been at a Shabbat service, or you've been at a high holiday service, I'm sure, where you felt really connected. And I'm sure you've been maybe at a service too, or somewhere else where you feel disconnected, right? There's like a lot of, there's a lot of negativity in here. There's a lot of whatever it might be. We need that positive, right? We need that connection. And it's right here in our part of our tradition. Also, when it comes to the stigma now, pikuach nefesh, right? Pikuach nefesh is this idea of saving somebody, right? Where it comes up mostly is for Shabbat observant people, right? Pikuach nefesh, doche Shabbat, right? You push off Shabbats to save a life, right? So if somebody needs something, you don't say, well, I'm Shomer Shabbat, I can't do this for you, or I can't help you. I was an EMT for 16 years, and I was a volunteer EMT here in the Pico Robertson area for Hatzalah, which is like a Jewish group. And there were many Shabbats where I got in my car or did other things that I wouldn't, obviously for myself, wouldn't normally do to help somebody, right? So this is the same thing when it comes to somebody who's struggling with addiction, right? It's important that we're there for them. And that doesn't mean that you can personally, right? We can't save everybody. And yet we can help direct people, right? Ultimately, it has to come from within, i.e. the person, but to ignore it, right, is pushing away our obligation of pikuach nefesh, right? And I brought this Mishnah specifically where I find it, I'm sure we've all heard it before in some form or another, where it says Adam, the first person, was created alone to teach, right? That anyone who destroys one's soul, it's as if you destroy an entire world, and you save a soul, it's as if you save an entire world. And we see that with our world. If you've ever experienced, which we probably everybody here in this Zoom has, death in your life, right? You've experienced it. It's not just a one, it's not just one person, right? And you see that all the time where tragedy hits, right? You see it with all kinds of things when one person, it's not just, oh, that person's dead. It's they had a mom and a dad, or they had children, or they had a partner, or they had a job, whatever, and it impacts, and sometimes it impacts a community, right? And it's very, it's on so many levels. It impacts us when somebody passes away, right? And so when we have an opportunity to be there for somebody, it's important that we are able to take that opportunity to help be of service. And then this is a Hasidic spiritual principle, which is looking with the right eye. Again, judging everybody in a good light. So, in yeshiva, they taught us to always look with the right eye, right? So we have the right eye and the left eye. And so the left is seen, spiritually speaking, as gevura, which means like judgment. Right is seen as chesed. And in the middle is seen as tiferet, which is beauty. And so, but since physically we have two eyes, spiritually, right, where we put the tefillin is like this third eye, right, that area. But when we see somebody, we're supposed to cover our left eye, which is not always easy to do, by the way. But we're supposed to see with the right eye, and the right eye says, "I'm going to see with kindness," right? And so, people that are struggling with addiction, a lot of times they test our patience. They really do. They put a lot of difficulty on friends and family and community. That is true, right? And so trying to see with the right eye, trying to see with positive. So I'm just going to finish with just, I'll stop talking. I know I talked a lot, but what can we do? And how can we, be there for others? So I'm going to stop. And
You didn't talk too much. It was very good.
Dasha Koach, thank you, Rabbi.
I didn't talk.
I'm curious about the component of courage. I'm lately been focused a lot on that, and I'm wondering if you have some personal examples of courage within the addiction community that and how that courage came about, or what was the spark for that made people move from one place to another place, to have that courage to make that transition.
So, honestly, the first one that came to my mind, which is a little bit of an older experience that I remember, I would say a lot of times, truthfully, the courage comes because there's not a choice anymore. You only have two choices. I'm going to live or die. Now, that's, where are you going to go? So I think of somebody who was struggling with addiction. They had multiple addictions, and they had been married for 28 years. And honestly, their spouse found out, and they had two choices at that point. They're going to lose their family or not lose their family. So they took the courage to step forward, because there are plenty of people that don't, right? They continue down that path. But it was more of a necessity at that point, if that makes sense. It wasn't necessarily, was it a courageous act? Yes. And truthfully, they didn't want to lose everything. And at that point, they were going to lose everything. They had a very successful business. They had a loving spouse. They had kids that they loved. And it was, I'm going to lose that all, or I'm going to do what needs to be done. And so they did what needed to be done, which is great. So that I see as sometimes that courage. I would say almost always something hits the person, if you've ever heard the term, hitting rock bottom. So, hitting that rock bottom, whatever that proverbial rock bottom was for that person, then allows them the opportunity to say, like, I've got to do this. Now, there are people that hit rock bottom and that don't do that, right? I would also say that courage is tied in to ego. The ego of saying, I can't do this alone. The ego of saying, I'm better than those people, right? Oh, so this guy was struggling with, it was multiple addictions, right? So, people that are sex addicts, those are people that wear raincoats and that like flash people, or those are pedophiles, right? And that's not necessarily those are, both of those are, I wouldn't even say fall into that category, right? And so like casting that judgment and saying like, no, wait a minute, what, I have an issue, and I can break my ego down and say, I can go in and say, I can't do this. I have a problem. So that's the courageous part, is allowing the ego to not tell you something else. And we all have an ego to one degree or another. It's, do we allow that to control what we do, or do we use it in a healthy manner?
Sandy?
Sandy, just go ahead.
Sandy, go ahead.
Bill, I can say for myself, I have a food addiction. And the only thing, and I have been in 12-step programs for 23 years. And to me, the only courage, and for many others, is walking through the door for that first meeting. Because when you sit down, these people are laughing. They're laughing their heads off, and they're hugging one another. And there's nothing that you can say in a meeting where people don't nod their heads and say, that happened to me. And for me personally, I tried everything before multiple times. And there were people there who for over 20, 25 years had kept off a loss of 200 pounds. And that was like a miracle. And they tell you, don't leave before the miracle. And it was, it was so easy. They give you their guidelines in 12-step programs. Here's what worked for us. You get a sponsor who's happy to take your call daily. And it's amazing the magic you find. You find the love in these programs. I mean, you can go and you can be an idiot and say something stupid, and next week the people will come and hug you.
Go ahead, Sandy. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. We had this interesting discussion at Shabbat dinner. I was with Sandy, and I talked about the fact that I have a personal prayer practice that I do every day outside of what I do in synagogue, just between me and Hashem. And now Linda, my fiance, has very much participates with it. But for me, I find having that personal discussion with Hashem and saying maybe 5 prayers that resonate with me every day. And usually we find a beautiful place to do it, outdoors in nature is really helpful for me to get through my day and for us to get through the day together. It just puts me in the right place. So there's something that goes on between me and Hashem and you and Hashem that can happen. But if we allow a space for that to happen, to truly happen, it just really, I find it very helpful for me too. I mean, and Sandy, the reason I mentioned Sandy was because Sandy said, oh my gosh, I have a personal practice too. Me and Hashem have a, by the way, Sandy, I've used that example many, I hope it's with your permission, but
Of course.
I've used that example many times of this. Yeah, she has this, Sandy said she does this too. And I said, oh my God, how terrific, how great that there are others that are thinking kind of a ways that work for them. However, obviously it works differently for everybody, but I find that very helpful for me.
I want to say something.
Oh, Linda.
I want to comment on your last slide and the quote, which says to see with your right eye, the right eye of compassion, and to hide the judgmental left eye. And I'm sure you're very familiar with this, but my father had a stroke that hit the left side of his brain and not the right side. And I learned more about the structure of the brain. And the right side is, in fact, the side that is more open, loving, and compassionate in the brain biologically. I mean, all of you may know this. To me, it was news. And the left side is the judgmental side. And my father transformed. He was paralyzed and he couldn't do anything for the first year. And he lived 4 more years. I mean, he couldn't feed himself or get out of bed or anything, couldn't walk. But he had gone from a very judgmental, difficult man. He was a bomber pilot in World War II and a tough guy. At the age of 87, when he had this stroke, and suddenly he became this very loving, compassionate, understanding man that he had never been in his life that I had known him. So it's interesting that ancient people understood the right eye, the right side of the brain, as being the one that holds that ability to be compassionate. And I'm just curious. I mean, some of you are scientists here, like Frederica. Maybe you have an opinion on that, but I find that astonishing.
Well, I do have a question for you. How was his ability to speak after he had the stroke? You're muted.
You're muted.
You're muted somehow.
It was slightly compromised. He retained almost all of his faculties. Maybe 5% of his very smart man was not functioning at the usual level. But he
was able to speak. Okay.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Once he got over the first 6 months it was a dire situation. But my mother wouldn't let them. She kept saying the doctors were trying to kill him because they kept saying he'd have no life worth living. He actually walked again, how amazingly people recover. And he was always very athletic. So this was satisfying. But the main thing was that he became this highly compassionate person.
Right. No, I'm just trying to understand. So when he first had the stroke, he did have trouble with speech and he gradually recovered it. Is that what you're telling me?
He recovered speech rather quickly. I mean,
okay. It helps me understand what was going on in his brain. We'll talk more later.
Oh, okay. Another interest. But it's just that ancient wisdom would make that differentiation is shocking to me.
Yeah, it's interesting because as we get more advanced, whatever that means, and more technologically advanced, which we are, it's interesting how we come back to ancient certain things, wisdom that's been there that we almost scoffed at, part of our history as a people.
Be careful with that though, because we remember the things that now relate, and the things that we said 1,000 years ago that were totally wrong, we forgot. So it wasn't 100% right then.
Right. No. I'm just saying.
So yeah, you're right. I agree with you. I agree with you, but I also say that it's more complicated.
Of course.
It's a little bit of selection bias, as we like to say.
Rabbi, I think you're making these connections are brilliant. It's
Yeah,
just,
they're very
I
good.
love the way you pull this together and how you base it on sources as well. It's just brilliant. I haven't seen this before in this way in a Jewish context.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I want to just acknowledge what Sandy said before. And I appreciate what you said, saying like the biggest courage is walking in right to a room. And I think this was the thing that Rabbi Twersky was really focused on, this idea of walking into a room of 10, 20, 50, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, people that you maybe don't know the first time. Maybe somebody brought you there, maybe they didn't. And to be able to be honest and authentic, right? And I mean, we live in LA where authenticity is really difficult. It's at a premium to find it. And so to be able to be authentically vulnerable, and people are looking and listening and not judging at all. And if somebody's judging, the truth is they will acknowledge it within themselves at some point. They'll be like, wow, I was really meaning they're not going to tell you. They'll process that themselves. But in general, people will be open and listening, and you see that there is life, which is the beauty. And we don't always, that's what he was saying is sometimes missing within our communities, our spiritual communities, right? In the synagogue, because it's, oh, Sandy, she's, I don't know, has a Bentley and is a job here. So or the president, right? And so we have to honor, and it doesn't matter what type of person Sandy might be. I'm sure you're a wonderful person, but you get what I'm saying. Whereas in these rooms, it's the only place, truthfully, where there's true egalitarianism, true 100%, because nobody cares who you are, nobody cares where you came from. They just care, what can I do to help you? And that's that's spirituality at its essence. I really love V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. I care about you. I don't care about all the accoutrements which come and go, which, by the way, every single person gets sucked into one way or another because we're human. We can't help it. It's what we do. We all are guilty of it in one way or another. But in these meetings, you really have that. So.